Our next speaker this morning will be Janet Miller. Janet is an independent researcher from St. Louis. She has a Bachelor of Science in History and her Master's in American History from Iowa State University. Janet is a member of the Center for French Colonial Studies, the Concord Sappington Historical Society, and the Sappington House Foundation, Les Amis, the Society of Architectural Historians, the St. Louis 250th Anniversary Program History and Programming Committee. Her primary area of interest is in French colonial history with emphasis on textiles in domestic use. Janet was also a presenter at our 2012 conference. The title of Janet's presentation will be A Tale of Two Stores, St. Genevieve in 1799. Please help me welcome Janet Miller.
I'm going to talk about two store journals. These are facsimiles, but they're the size of the original journals. One of them is Gibor. It's the account book that is in the family collection up in St. Louis Windsor History Museum. This one is in your St. Gen collection on microfilm, but you must have it in hard copy for the courthouse that keep those. It's an unknown merchant. It's been unknown for a long time, and it got out of the family, whoever owned this originally, got out of the family hands. It ended up in a pharmacy up in St. Louis on Easton Avenue, which was in Kenlock. It's in the airport now. Bell Telephone, Lindell 539, which sounds like what, 20th century? I don't know how long ago they had fronts. We're going to need to find out who this one belonged to in order for me to compare these two. This is 1799. Does anybody know another merchant in St. Gen in 1799?
Besides what?
Pardon me?
Menard Valley?
Yes, but they were well known. They put their names on everything. Bossier was much later. That was what I talked to Ron on 2 years ago. That was 1835. Okay, I found it out finally. For me, it was a eureka moment. I quietly said to the people at the desk in the archives, I'm having a eureka moment. I went outside and I screamed. Maybe some of you will too.
We had the same thing when we found the keyboard document.
Well, you're going to have it again. This is Gibor. This is the day book that goes with the account book.
Oh.
This is better. By far.
And can we get a copy of that?
It's in on your archives in the library. You're gone. This one is well organized. It's like any account book, and it would give you the impression that Gibor was kind of a stiff person. It doesn't give you the person that this one does. This one is many times illegible. It's got very creative spelling. The word for gingham is spelled about 5 different ways. Occasionally there's a word in English, like yard. He has a terrible time with names, spelling names. Dodge remains D-O-G-E to the end, and it's also in the account book that way. He may have been entertaining himself because words can be spelled differently because they all sound the same. He may have been just entertaining himself, I don't know. The activity of day-to-day is amazing. He was only in business apparently for 6 months, from November of 1799 to the end of May of 1800. That one goes on to 1802 because he continues to collect things that are due to him. And that one is only a record of people who bought on credit. They might have paid at the time, that they walked away with his goods from his store, or they might have paid much later, some up to 1802. This one has a lot of people and goods mentioned, not by name, well, goods are mentioned by name, but the people aren't mentioned by name, because he is doing what he called vendu en comptant, meaning ready money. Some of them did have ready money. There's an amazing amount of specie in here, coins. Some of them paid in an equal amount of bartered goods, so it doesn't give the person's name at all. So there's a lot more going on in his store than that would ever tell you. There are also people mentioned in here that are not mentioned in there. Let me give you some information about some of his clients. There were 5 Aubuchons. There's an Aurora. No, is that first name, last name? I don't know. There's one that looks like, I don't even know if he's trying to spell, it looks like it says a surgeon, but it's all one word, yes.
There was a baptism that Louis went to for an Aurora, who was a slave of one of the merchants in town.
There are slaves mentioned in here, but when they're mentioned by their owner. He never,
It wasn't.
there's no
It was a-
other.
It was people at slaves.
It was people were enslaved, yeah.
Ah,
And it was a very unusual name. I mean, it's not a very common name in that period of history. So anyway, we can talk about that afterwards.
awesome, thank you. Bolduc, father and son, Bouquet, Bazin, I've never heard of some of these names. Bouet, Belhumeur, Ballin, Wood, that's a girl, Jean Wood. Boyer, Brenda Moore, Louis Boyer, Brenda Moore,
That's
Buta,
a nickname that Brenda
is it?
Well, I was wondering if somebody could value more.
Well, then, Etienne Bolduc, B-U-A-L, Barbeau, which is his wife's family, Chauvin. There's a Henry Canadian and a Canada. Courant, Carpenter, Champagne, Chevalier, which reminds me, Chevalier was a woodworker. Chevalier made the pickets for the fences, perche. He also made staves for barrels. So with books like these, you can find out what people did for a living. You find out what was important to them. You find out what they knew how to do. Why don't more people translate these things? I was talking to a woman who's a translator for one of the universities up in St. Louis. I thought her major language was German and French. So I started telling her about what I do. Her eyes got big, just astounding, not in support for what I do, more in fear. And she stepped back and she said repeatedly that anyone would do that. That anyone would do that. Why don't more people do this? These have been around since 1799. The things you can learn in here, nobody else is going to tell us unless we read these. Okay, anyway, there are 2 pages. Menard, Maxwell, Masson, Martin, Manuel. I don't know Emmanuel. He uses last name, it's not first name, so it's not Manuel Lisa, but he is from St. Louis. Madid, M-A-D-I-D. There was a Manuel here, 2 here. Moreau. Fenwick went by doctor. He's listed as doctor. He did wholesale business. He sold to stores, other stores, as well as retail. Okay. Some of the people, these are the pages that I used when I was writing down. I can only work on this for about 3 hours at a time. I'd start writing things on the long pages. I divided them into textiles, which is my passion. So there were this many pages of textiles. Yes, lots. There were this many of handkerchiefs, mouchoirs. And as Bob was talking this morning, he had mouchoirs from everywhere. A kind called Désiré, most of them were from places. Most of them were in Britain. Cholet, Denim, and, which is India. One was Mousseline. Some were from Switzerland. They were all different prices. Sweden, this is trim, threads, and threads by this time were coming in numbered sizes. I don't know if it's the same way we do numbers, but they were coming in numbered sizes. You could get them in linen, you could get them, they didn't mention cotton. You could get them in silk. And they came in colors. You could get them in packets, you could get them in hanks. If you were here for the Beaussier presentations, full thread doesn't start until the 1830s. So there was trim, there were accessories, there were lots of hats, all different kinds of hats, wool, fur, baby hats. I'm assuming it was a christening present. There were stockings galore. We know that the colonists did not weave. They bought all of their fabrics, and I'll give you some of the fabrics that they bought in just a minute. But I do now know, because I found spinning wheels in inventories, that they spun. And I'm assuming that they knit. French have knit forever. So I'm assuming that stockings was one of the things they knit, because there certainly weren't enough pairs of stockings bought to wear daily. Shoes they bought, shawls, they bought parasols, only 2 vests, gilets, but one was a pattern. And this is the list of avoirs, the things that he would take in trade for the value of the goods. A minot of onions. He also took sweet potatoes. He took a lot of services. I now know that his goods came from Pittsburgh via Louisville on a barge, and he hired people to manage the barge when it got here and to help him unload it. He also would hire people to do deliveries. You could not only buy a parasol, but you could pay to have it delivered to your sweetheart. And there were men buying things for women that didn't have their same last name, so I'm assuming some of that. Gallons of whiskey, lead galore, and from people you wouldn't suspect, like valet's clerk Leclerc. Madame Leclerc brought in one, well, I'm sure she didn't bring it personally, but she brought one of the biggest quantities of lead of anybody in this book. All kinds of skins. Sometimes he would just say garden goods, comestibles. 10 bushels of sweet potatoes. That was a great deal. Carrots, another little carrots of tobacco. François Valet was one of the people who exchanged that. Minots of salt, a hog, beef. I'm assuming it was beef skinned and butchered. But there was a mention of 2 beef, which may have been a pair of oxen. Flour, there was a lot of flour and different kinds of flour. corn, more corn than I thought there must be. Pots of grease, there's a turkey. And they made a point of saying that it was a male turkey. Buffalo robes, 21 pots of tapia. Bob has noted there were violin strings, and there are far more listed in the little book.
Yeah, in the first one, I think we found 12 people that they sold violins to. So you can tell who the fiddlers were.
Yeah, a bundle.
It's a weird family.
They didn't say.
Yeah, musically, these French were very, very different from what we know now. Standard pitch was 379 compared to standard pitch, which is 440 today. And I had a fiddler tune his fiddle to 379. It's awesome. It's low, it's mellow. The sound peg in a violin was in a different place in those days than it is now. Sometimes violins didn't have the same sets of strings that we would know today in terms of the numbers of strings. Strings were made from catgut and goat or sheep gut, I should say, and they were made processed by natural things, not chemicals as we would do today. And they were very, very hard to keep in tune. The bows were curved, so you couldn't get the pressure that you can get on a violin today, and you couldn't get vibrato. So it must have been a very wonderful mellow sound. Chickens, eggs, one cow, a beaver. One thing that Louis Bolduc brought in was a tooth. It's oakum that you use to
Seal seams and both.
right. And it sounded like Ybor had purchased it for his own boat, and maybe even bought the service as well as the goods. Candles, sugar, which must have been maple sugar, bottles of tapia, all kinds of good stuff.
It was even very low price in this one.
That was to transport goods back and forth. He had clients on the East Bank as well, or he would have things delivered. A lot of his clients were the old Kaskaskia people. He recognized the names from Kaskaskia. Okay, some clients that were not in his account book. A Samsa, Joseph Samsa, I've not heard of before. Morrison, William Morrison, the guy who had the big stores over in Kaskaskia and Cahokia. Deroussier, apparently didn't pay his bills. His son Camille paid them for him. And you can tell in the small book that Ybor had an affection for Camille because he doesn't use his last name ever. He just refers to him as Mr. Camille. And the father bought gambling games. There's even a reference to me that sounded like a roulette wheel.
First casino.
There's a name that I couldn't read, but it wasn't in the other book. Thinelik. Does that sound familiar to anything anybody knows? There's a Clegan, Klegan. And there's a Prague, that one I could be Prade. No, not Pratt. Pratt is very clearly La Valle. The valet is in here, and two generations of valets are in here, but there was also a La Valle, one word. J.B. Martin. Senbzin. That one I could read. That's how he spelled it. De la Suisse. Ristore, W-I-S-T-O-R-E, first name is Jacques. Lachmache, L-A-C-H-M-A-C-H-E, last name Masson. There's a guy from the Vincennes Post, Dubois. A Baptiste Michaud, there's a Michel Michaud in here, but Baptiste, no. And then this guy's referred later to as Baptiste Placet, P-L-A-C-E-T, Michaud. Guy was referred to twice, M-O-D-U-I-N-E, and then M-O-D-I-N-E. And he says, note Julien. There's a son named Jules, but Julien, I don't know. Again, in this slave, I don't know. A guy, R-A-U-E-E. And normally in this old French, they don't use accents, like aigu, grave, but he does. He uses the aigu. R-A-U-E-E, first name Baptiste. Louis Trudeau, he lists himself in the little book, he doesn't list himself in the other book. Stackhouse, S-T-A-K-H-O-U-S-E, English I'm sure. Conlier, C-O-N-E-L-L-I-E-R. And Surrey is at the very, very end of the last page. Okay, if I can find my list of fabrics, I will list you some of the textiles. Gilmore does not sell cups and saucers or dinnerware that I could find. As I'm remembering, I didn't write all this down on the list. I have to go back through and read this again. But I think there were a couple of cauldrons, but I didn't find much else for cooking. Textiles is his big thing, and he seems to be very good at accessing textiles that he brought in that they hadn't had before. From Bretagne, which is tough because that's where the good linen came from. I'm assuming when he says Brittany that he means those wild flower things that the Britons were also known for. Landien, and he has French, English, and American. In 1799, there were 4 guys in Philadelphia making Landien, which we would today probably call chintz. One of them was extremely famous, Houston. If we got stuff from Houston out here, I'd be the one screaming on the floor. So I need to do some more research on that, but he obviously had good connections. CMYs, cotton velour, and people were, very seldom do you find something like a half an own, which is 1.18 yard. Occasionally a third, and the things that were bought in that size, I'm assuming they were using like the collars for trims. Mostly it's in pieces, and the pieces came like 34 yards. Pieces were narrow. I only have one piece of fabric from this era. It's supposedly Flower de Gis, the good stuff that Napoleon liked. Landien came in 2, you can see that it was narrow, but you could also get wide fabrics. Landien came in 2 styles. It came in the flowers and the vines that you would wear in dress goods, and almost none of that is around anymore, even in Europe. Very occasionally they will find pieces, and they're in museums. People used it for waistcoats, they used it for linings, they used it obviously for dresses, for boudoir gowns, and they just wore it to death. There was also this architectural stuff. They didn't use this for cushions, they used it for bed hangings, they used it for window hangings. This is the stuff that stays around because it didn't get used as much. But this would be French. Napoleon supposedly.
What fabric is that?
Linen. Now, everything still in 1799 was handmade. They're buying these. They're coming from factories, but they're all handmade. Hand spun, hand woven, all natural dyes, hand printed. If it's indigo, they probably penciled it on. When you pencil it on. Sometimes I don't know what these things are, like Calmont, C-A-L-M-O-N-T, is obviously a place. It's not on any of my maps. I use some really old maps. It's not in any of my dictionaries, so I don't know what it is. CMYs, I can pass these around. These are some samples out of books of the kinds of fabric that they would have had be able to buy in those days. One of them, and some of you have heard this before, this is the one thing that really made me cry. One of the types of fabrics is guinea, like the country in Africa that's in trouble right now. It was a fabric that was made for the slave trade. People from Africa were bought as slaves for that fabric, with that fabric. That same fabric was sold here. And we're assuming that they knew, that people here knew, when we didn't care. That's not a cruel comment. Nanking, which was from China, it was, remember Master and Commander, the Patrick O'Brien series, Captain Aubrey likes Nankin for his everyday pants. It's twill, it's cotton, it's a yellow cotton, a natural yellow cotton. Pieces of Russi, which would be linen sheeting from Russia, the best of the time. Lots of that was sold. What else is in here? Flannel, which would have been woolen flannel. Morlaix, again, probably a linen, I guess one of the best linens. It's Brittany. Blonde lead, so that's one of the terms that took me, L-E-Z-E, took me a long time to figure out. They put a crinkled finish into the fabric, and they would do it by pulling the warps so that the whole piece of fabric would crinkle off. They had seersucker at this time, and they would do that the same way. What else? I'm running through the things I just told you. They repeat. Drap. Sometimes you spell it D-R-A-P or D-R-A-P-T. It just means drapery. It just means fabric. So I don't know whether it was cotton, whether probably not cotton. Cotton was pretty rare in those days. Cotton came from the Levant, in fact you read about the time. It did not grow in Egypt in those days, and we weren't producing it here. Draped could have been wool, because they're talking about it being blue or green. If it was wool, they would have used it for suiting for men. It could have just been for curtains just to hang around beds. I don't know. Cootie, C-O-U-T-I, ticking. Ticking was for clothing. They made shirts out of it. It's a pretty fabric. It's not what you think of on your mattress today, but they did use it for mattress covers. They used it for the inside of horse collars. They used it for window curtains. 12 year lines, that you know would be linen. They loved linen, and if you think about it, it would be a very practical fabric for you because it's durable, it wears well, it's cool, you can make it thicker, and it lasts. Lots of gingham, they wore gingham, they used it in their curtains. 12 is long. The Flanders, it just, same stuff, over and over and over, it just repeats.
He calls out G-I-N-G-A, is that his game from, or is that different?
J-I-N-G-A is the normal way to spell it in those days. He spells it J-I-N-G-A, G-I-N-G-A. Sometimes he does it gingham, just as we would, G-I-N-G-H-A-M. Sometimes he does it G-U-I-N-G-A-M. I think he must have been entertaining himself with funny spellings. Plush, I'm assuming that means plush. It's the same fabric as velvet, velour, or plush. It just depends on how high the nap is. And again, that's all handmade. They pull up some of the weft, and then they cut it by hand, and they have to do it evenly. It's all handmade. Muslin, so it's just the same stuff, just repeats over and over, but just there are hundreds and hundreds of yards of fabric. I gotta add it up. I would say probably 1,000 yards total. Beadron, E-I-D-R-O-N. I haven't found that in here. One of the things that I found in an inventory, not in his book, that Colonel Eckford couldn't identify when he did his ballet book. Some of you have seen this already. These were also from the same time period. They're an Indian tree of meat. Remember when you were in the 70s or the 60s and you had these on your bed? Yeah, this is a really bad example, but the same stuff that was around when the English first went to India in the 1600s, and then it's just been repeated forever. There's, in the French colonial era would have been well done. This is badly done. But there was one of these on a window in Kosovo House. An Indian tree light. I've also shown some of you a piece of fabric that I bought in St. Charles at Joann's about 10 years ago. This also is an example from this would have been from the English in the 1600s from India. This would be like a calico, they would have called it calico. It would have been all hand done. This one is, I think, hand done. And this is an example of the debate that the English had with the Indians and the English North. They did not like these dark backgrounds. They wanted a white or yellow. And in the English trade, and then when the French started duplicating and making these things, Marseille was essential to make this kind of print. This has paisley's on it because the Indians at that point were trading with Persia, so this was their kind of style. So this kind of stuff has been around us all the time. It's what would have been from the French colonial era, hasn't left us, but it's what they had. Okay, questions?
So how did you figure out that it was before?
It's the same stuff. It's organized entirely differently. Like in the account book, the dates of purchase are not important at all. In the day book, that's what's the organizing force. So you're set up as you're reading it to go in different directions. And I had to overcome that. But once I started looking at the tiny little folio numbers in the day book and comparing them with the folio numbers here and seeing that the names were the same and the clothes were the same, that's when I had my really going. But it's interesting that there's a lot of stuff that he never puts in here. And Morrison bought a pair of shoes. He's named, he paid for them in cash. So it's not consistent. I need to go through, and this will take some time, which is probably why nobody else is doing this. I need to go through and see what else he left out, one book from the other, and what his thought was. This one you can read the handwriting, the ink, he was careful. That one is just, sometimes just words.
Janet was right on that. You don't even know a lot about what was going on. We always said here that the people from the draft board blue handkerchiefs on their head and the ones from Montreal wore red. Well, I think red was the most popular color that he sold in Chalet. But he's selling 10 or 12 different colors.
At least. And different weights, different qualities. I reviewed an inventory that the Arch Museum has. It was an inventory of everything Spain brought into New Orleans in 1803. And not only is it translated from French or whatever to Spanish, it's by a guy who clearly doesn't know sometimes what he's talking about. But he doesn't retain the French love of fabrics. People here bought fabrics because they could, they had the money, but because they were French. It was the national industry. And each little village throughout, somewhere I have, and I will find it for you. I'll find it later. I have a listing of the towns in France that made Landienne. It's many pages long, tiny little type. These towns were known for their styles, they were known for their quality. And that's how the French and Gibor knew what the fabric was. And once you take away that name and just call it toile, which is a ubiquitous term for fabric, or call it linen, you've lost the definition of that fabric. And the Spanish inventory takes all that away. Very, very seldom does it mention the origin. So it's very, very little use to us.
Gibor was a true Frenchman.
Yes.
He had come first to the islands and was a secretary to the plantation owner during the 1791 rebellion. Left and went back to France and then came to Philadelphia 1798, St. Joseph 1799. And so he probably had contacts that he was from the Loire Valley.
And I'd like to know how he financed all of this. They didn't, if you ever looked at the Jules de Mun records, there's a lot of conversation in there about when they got reimbursed for the losses that they had had during the Revolution. Whether it was whole or in part, there was an attempt at reimbursement. But that was far, far later in the store. This took a lot of money to run the store.
His father-in-law had been a source of the Jean-Baptiste Bordeaux.
But that would have been local. This had to be somebody on the East Coast who knew him, who trusted him. Barbeau would not have had ready cash or proof. He had to have made a connection.
Well, there were a number of them just across the river a little bit earlier.
Not like this. And Morrison This is about the time Morrison shows up, so it would have been through him. Giroux is another one that came over and just said hello. And is not in the any question?
Did you find any transactions with Native Americans in any of these books at all?
No.
No.
There were the slaves. People would send their slaves in. And that's another thing we can get out of these. We can get the names of the slaves that we wrote in on and their owners. No.
What about any reference to beaver pelts or beaver hats or firearms or guns? Knives?
He sells the flints. He has a guy who, for his barter to buy things out of the store, repairs carvings and fusil. But he doesn't sell the guns.
There's no reference to beaver.
There are some skins. He takes in a couple of skins, not many. I think the skins were kind of rare by this time, by 1799, weren't they? But I know he takes in a couple of skins on barter. And he turns around and sells some things to some of the major traders of pelts. I don't know who he was. This is the list of the towns, villages in France that made Lannigan. I can pass this around too, but it's really expensive. And this is just Lannigan. There were a lot of denim, it was very common. Denim, made denim. The other thing, some of the he sells table linens. And Valet is still buying table linens in 1799, cloths and napkins by the dozen. And there's a reference that the word is diapered. Do you know what diapered means? It means a pattern that is very, very small, uniform throughout the piece, that's in squares or diamonds. And again, that's the name of the place that made them. In World War I, the troops called the place Wipers. It's E. Y-I-P-R-E-S. But if it's D-E, it's diaper.
Why did it close?
Why did it close? I don't know. And I have found an ad for a guy whose name starts with R, I can't remember, I have it, I can look it up, who about 3 years later opened a store in which he very proudly said was the place of Guybor's store. So Guymore may have sold what was left in his store. I would guess if he financed this well, he did extremely well. And he probably didn't have to run the store anymore. Morrison was in business by then, so he had some significant competition just across the river. I would guess he just didn't have to. If you look at this little book, it was a lot of work every day. It was a lot of work. And to get the goods in, to keep the records, it was a huge amount of work. I also don't find medicines in here. They had some natural medicines that they were buying. The one thing that they sell quite a bit of, he does sell whiskey, he takes it in and then sells it. I don't remember that he sells the taffy though, come to think of it. He takes it in, but I don't remember him selling it. Remember the old mustard? Remember the old mustard commercials for football? He has the little round containers of mustard that he sells quite a bit of. Glasses, eyeglasses. Father Pratt is one of the first to buy eyeglasses. He buys a couple pair. Toothbrushes. He sells a lot of combs. Some of them are made from ivory. And I heard Joe Harrell give a presentation, he's the archaeologist up in St. Louis, and he showed us some of the bone combs, they're very fine combs, and he said they were for lice. And I was trying to remember, I think there is a reference in here to a fine cone. Again, the kind of thing we learn about these people by reading about what they thought. They had, there was one cone that was called a styling cone. I'm gonna guess it was like a rat tail cone, which you used to curl with. They had brushes for their horses, combs for their horses. Certainly more combs for horses than toothbrushes. It doesn't, I can also tell you from this list who made the bread ovens. There's some really skilled guys who we take service from.
What about tools for craftsmen?
No, mason's scissors, he mentions, and I don't even know what a mason would use scissors for, except for the string that they put up maybe. There are some boring, fine tools, fine work, nothing major, nothing big. Files, but nothing big, certainly nothing agricultural. And I didn't find that in Beaucier either. I would guess those were handmade. Oh, they buy hinges and they buy nails. Not a lot, but they buy them. And one of the things that Joe Hurl told us was that by 1800, and maybe here, you could buy what was a semi-manufactured nail. They had learned to extrude the metal, and they would cut it and then hammer it to make a head, which is better than hammering the whole thing to narrow it down. So you could get a more even size, even shaped nail. So that may be why they were buying nails. I don't know. What else? Locks. You could buy locks. There are shingles, yeah. But it gets his personal stuff all mixed up with his store stuff. And I sort of guess those were for him.
He did think of the stores, you know, painted down over the balls, you know, about 300 square miles of land, north of town, had
He's
some
in the
land.
mines too, they lived in the mines.
Yeah, he had the old mines concession, he had one of those.
But nothing of that is referenced in, say, you could guess that. Occasionally he'll turn around and sell the lead that he takes in. There's something I was gonna say, I just forgot. Yes.
Can you indicate how many employees you had?
I tried to guess by the handwriting in the day book. I couldn't. I'm pretty sure that there was at least one clerk, because the spelling would change pretty significantly from one day to the next. And that wasn't just Igor entertaining himself with funny spelling. The handwriting is boilerplate in those days, so it's pretty hard to recognize differences in handwriting. Plus, sometimes he was just so busy you could tell he didn't even have time to sharpen his quill properly. He sold a lot of quills, by the way. Fremont was one of his clients, and Fremont bought 100 quills from him. Anybody else?
Any idea who Fremont was?
The Fremont, the governor.
Oh,
Yeah. There's some other people that show up. Pretty important people. I need to start publishing this stuff. And somebody else needs to start reading this stuff. Landian. L apostrophe INDIENN. Yes. Okay.
Illinois, with an emphasis on ancient history. Roman history. David is a distinguished numismatist with an international reputation. Currently, he is Professor Emeritus, Illinois State University's History Department. While at Illinois State University, David came to know Dr. Carl Eckberg, the quintessential colonial St. Genevieve historian. Dr. Eckberg introduced him to the subject of French colonial history. Since his retirement, he has expanded his interest in this more recent period. He published French colonial-related articles in Le Journal and the Journal of the Early Americas. The title of his presentation for us today is 1752, A Crucial Year for St. Genevieve, Fort Deschartres, and Fort Duquesne. I give you Dr. McDonald.
I begin with an apology for my terrible French pronunciation. Long ago, I learned to read French, but I never learned to speak it. And now that I'd like to do so, my hearing is so deteriorated that I simply can't hear the nuances of pronunciation. One thinks of early St. Genevieve, the image familiar to most of us, I believe, is that of a tiny village established in the mid-18th century, which grew slowly until after the end of the French and Indian War, when the town increased significantly, as many of the French, not wanting to live under British rule, moved to the western side of the Mississippi. Certainly, St. Genevieve and that other little French village, St. Louis, did grow greatly after the British finally arrived to take control of Fort Deschartres, 1765. But what I want to suggest today is that there was an earlier period of rapid growth, beginning in 1752, when events in that year linked and shaped the destinies of St. Genevieve, Fort Deschartres, and Fort Duquesne, which was not built until 1754, but was planned in 1752. The official end of King George's War in 1748, the American phase of the War of Austrian Succession, brought no peace to North America, but rather something like an 18th century Cold War. English traders moved increasingly into territory claimed by France. There the English used cheap trade goods and abundant alcohol to persuade with varying success Indian tribes to turn against the French and ally themselves with the English. English subterfuge spread chaos through the tribes of the Great Lake region and the Illinois country, even jeopardizing long-standing friendly relations between the Illinois and the French. In the late 1740s, a group of Miami Indians under the leadership of a well-known chief variously called Memeskia, Turtle by the Miami, La Demoiselle by the French, and Old Britain by the English, broke away from the rest of the traditional leadership of the tribe and from the French alliance and went over to the English. The Demoiselle's pro-English faction sought to strengthen their position by cajoling the other tribes, including the Illinois, to join them in the English. Provocateurs traveled to Illinois and elsewhere, claiming to speak for a broad array of tribes from the north and east, urging the Illinois and others to turn against the French, threatening them if they did not, promising an abundance of English trade goods if they did. Lieutenant Monstell's machinations continued into the early 1750s. He led his followers into the Ohio country, where they established the village of Pickawillany, modern Piqua, Ohio, and the British built a trading post and stockade there. And the French and those Indians who remained loyal to them struck back. In mid-1752, that magic year again, the French Métis officer Charles Michel de Longley, with about 240 Ottawa and Ojibwa, and a few French Marines from Detroit, led an attack on Pickawillany. They destroyed the village, and to make a point to La Demoiselle's followers, they killed him, boiled him, and ate him. About 6 months after this cannibal feast, Jean-Jacques de McCarthy-McTee became commandant of Fort Deschartres. In December of 1751, when McCarthy arrived, the old wooden Fort Deschartres was in poor shape. Margaret K. Brown and Robert Mazurman had recently revealed through both documentary and archaeological work that the third wooden fort of Fort Deschartres, which was built in 1732, was in bad shape by then and needed to be replaced, particularly since McCarthy had brought a lot of troops with him, 4 companies, tripling the size of the Fort Richard garrison. So the decision had to be made where to build the fort. Governor Pierre-François de Rigaud, the Marquis de Vaudreuil-Tavenant, wanted the new fort built somewhere near Kaskaskia, which of course was by far the largest of the French villages. And McCarthy, along with Francois Saucier, the chief engineer sent to Illinois to design the new fort and oversee its construction, seemed initially to have favored the Kaskaskia location until they got here. However attractive site near Kaskaskia might have seemed, we're looking at a map in New Orleans, actual inspection of potential construction sites kind of dimmed their enthusiasm. Sites on the same side of the Kaskaskia River as the village were low and wet and subject to flooding. Sites on the bluffs across the river had poor access to any water and were poorly situated to protect Kaskaskia or any of the other settlements. Moreover, the Kaskaskia River was judged often too shallow for convenient transport of materials to or from the fort. So after considerable consideration of alternative sites, McCarthy and Saucier decided to put the new stone Fort Richard not at all far from the old wooden ones. This is where the discussion of the siting of Fort Richard usually rests. But I want to add another element to that decision, one that connects the new Fort Richard to Saint Genevieve, which in 1752 was a very new settlement itself, and to Fort Duquesne, which in 1752 was not yet even built. Fort Duquesne, what is it? There's the old guy, named after Michel-Ange de Duquesne de Genevieve, the Marquis de Duquesne, the governor of Canada from 1752 to 55. By all accounts, Duquesne was an imperious, judgmental, irascible fellow. He was also a man with a plan to stop the English. The key, he felt, was the watershed of the Ohio River Valley, long claimed by France, but not effectively settled. If the region were protected by a series of French forts and garrisons, the loyalty of the region's Indian tribes could be assured, and English traders and settlers who had infiltrated the area could be chased back home. To this end, he began in 1752 to plan the strengthening of 3 existing forts and to construct 4 new forts. Fort Presqu'île, on the southern shore of Lake Erie, modern Erie, Pennsylvania, planned 1752, built 1753. Fort Ledoux, formerly Fort de la Rivière, on the Blue Creek, a tributary of French Creek in modern Waterford, Pennsylvania, also planned in 1752 and built in 1753. Fort Longchamp, near the confluence of French Creek with the Allegheny at Mount Franklin, Pennsylvania, planned 1752, built 1754, and then the crown jewel, Fort Duquesne itself, at the juncture of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, which joined to form the Ohio River at that point, now downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, built in 1754. So how does all of this connect with Saint Genevieve and Fort Richard? The question arose from the first, how to supply these forts and their garrisons. There were several possibilities. Supplies could come down from Montreal, but Canada was already hard-pressed to feed the civilians and troops there, the numbers of which were soon to be increased substantially by new troops sent from France. The Canadian supply system was also in the hands of the notorious Intendant Bigot and his creatures, and was profoundly corrupt and inefficient. Moreover, the Canadian route could be subject to sudden incursions of the British from New England or New York, were pressed close to the southern shore of Lake Ontario. The Montreal route also required the unloading of supplies and the laborious porterage around the Niagara Falls, then the reloading on a separate fleet of bateaux on the other side of the falls. Supplies might come from Detroit along the lake, but Detroit had a very limited agricultural base itself and often required supplies from Canada. Or supplies might come from the Illinois country. The plan was put in effect to supply these forts from all of these locations as needed and resources allowed, but the bulk of the food, flour and preserved meat, would come from Illinois. That, however, would be no easy matter. Material was first gathered in Fort Richard, or the other storehouses at Cahokia and Kaskaskia, and then stowed on bateaux. This is a rather bucolic scene of a bateau by Carl Bodmer entitled Evening Bivouac on the Upper Missouri. It dates from the 1830s, 80 years later, but the boats were not essentially different. This is a rather small bateau. Such a pretty scene, I couldn't not show it. Well, then these bateaux had to be rowed for a distance of about 1,400 miles. Generally down the Mississippi to the mouth of the Ohio, then up the Ohio, always against the current, Fort Duquesne, in what is now western Pennsylvania, and further still to the other French forts. The Illinois convoys could only make the journey to the forts under the right conditions. If the Ohio were too low or too high and fast, the convoys couldn't proceed. And the trip was so long that it was unlikely that conditions would remain favorable for the entire voyage or the return. The bateaux could not sail. They had to be rowed by the soldiers of Fort Richard, the militias of the French villages, and slaves. The militias officially included all men with the exception of a few officials between the ages of 12 and 50. But that age regulation seems not to have been followed with exactitude and interpreted rather to mean everybody between the ages of puberty and decrepitude. Conditions in Illinois also played a role. At planting and harvesting time, labor was needed in the fields, not rowing bateaux. And if the bateau had nothing, and if they were taken away at those times, there wouldn't be anything to send up the Ohio. Even with an ample number of strong men, the push up the Ohio was back-breaking, made more difficult by the falls of the Ohio. A series of rapids at what is now Louisville. There, the river used to drop 26 feet over 2 miles of hard limestone rapids. The obstacle required the portaging of all of the equipment around the rapids and then hauling the bateaux up by sheer force and then repairing them at the top and reloading them. The trip was also dangerous. Chickasaw and Cherokee, allied with the English, frequented the banks of the Ohio, and the convoys had to mount constant guard, and still there were attacks and casualties. If the Ohio route was too dangerous or blocked by the British, you could take an alternate route. Down the Mississippi, up the lower Ohio, then up the Wabash, nearly to its headwaters, then up the Little River. There, near modern Fort Wayne, goods could be carted across the famous Wabash Maumee portage, also called the Miami portage, and then taken down the Maumee to Lake Erie, and then along the lake to Fort Presqu'île, and from there portaged again to the waterways and distributed to the other forts, or maybe even taken all the way up to Fort Niagara. The route was just as laborious as the Ohio route and could be equally dangerous. In May of 1753, McCarthy reported to the Minister of Marines in France. One boat, which had been caught on an obstacle, was obliged to remain behind the convoy. Having entered into a little river, thinking themselves safe, the 13th of last month, 8 men were killed, a man wounded, and a girl who was going to join her relatives was carried off as a prisoner. An Illinois chief assures me that 200 or 300 men of the rebel tribes who spread along the rivers by which the French will pass. McCarthy's convoy system had a rough start. Crops were not good in 1752. The wheat in Illinois was attacked by rust, and the corn suffered from drought. Crops were even worse in 1753, both in Canada and Illinois, so badly there was a serious famine in Canada. In 1754, French America had no food reserves. And McCarthy in Illinois found it difficult to scrape together supplies for the French forts. Moreover, he had to procure the bateaus, to organize a system of loading, protecting, and manning them, and no complex system ever seems to flow perfectly from the beginning. Witness the Affordable Health Care Act. Duquesne, not an understanding, even-tempered, or even reasonable man, complained bitterly to France in 1753 that McCarthy was incompetent. But by 1754, when better crops produced more food and the convoy system was functioning efficiently, Duquesne had to admit grudgingly that McCarthy and Illinois were doing a good job. Even then, though, the entire supply system faced sudden crises. In late 1755, Captain Jean-Henry Dumont, the commandant of Fort Duquesne, wrote a very polite and rather pitiful note to McCarthy. After informing McCarthy that the English had cut his communications with Canada, he went on to write, "In such a delicate situation, I take it upon myself, sir, to ask you for food. We need 120,000 pounds of flour and 40,000 pounds of meat." McCarthy gathered all he could and sent it by convoy as early as possible in 1756. Even with the supplies from Illinois, however, the French forts faced shortages and garrisons had to be severely limited in size. But how does this all relate to Saint-Geneviève in 1752? Well, in 1752, Saint-Geneviève was by far the smallest of the French villages of Illinois. Witness the summary of McCarthy's census completed at the end of 1751 and shipped down to Governor Baltimore in New Orleans on the 1st of January 1752. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you read this. It's actually spread out across 2 pages, and if I did that, it would be about that wide in a big blur. It's pretty much a big blur anyway. But it's a very interesting census. Of course, it's not anywhere near perfect. No 18th century French census or any other census is. It's quite a summary. There are 26 categories of information. The French population is divided into 8 categories, slaves into 6, 7 categories of farm animals, and also lists diamond gunpowder, lead bullets, and land. We don't need to consider all of that here, just men and land. So I thought you might enjoy this disastrous rendering of the name Saint-Geneviève here. Comes out of Saint-Geneviève. Evidently, this was a scribe that McCarthy sometimes used, who wrote everything as he heard it. And I think he may have thought the name of the village was St. June the Widow or something like that. I don't think we can blame that on McCarthy. He was, after all, born and raised in Paris, and Genevieve is, of course, the patron saint of Paris. And he spelled the name of the village correctly, or nearly so, in September of 1752, as we'll see in a minute. Next slide. Here's the summary. Habitants, arpents frontage, and arpents under cultivation square. It's a small place. Just 7 habitants. Of course, those are not just males, those are farm owners, and you can expect each farm had an establishment around it of some size. There were also 3 young men capable of bearing arms and 3 volunteers in town. Volunteers seem to have hung out mainly around Kaskaskia or Fort Bouchard. They were largely landless young men who could be hired for their labor, thus volunteer in the sense of the English volunteer. Well, McCarthy's census of 1752 indicates that that year Saint Genevieve had under cultivation 34 arpents of river frontage and 797 arpents in area. Compare this with the other, no, excuse me, I've had myself. The other villages here already had more land under cultivation in Cahokia, practically the same amount as Saint Genevieve. Not terribly inferior compared to Roger, even though the number of inhabitants was very small.
Is that just the male habitants?
Yeah, there are a few women listed, and, but these are just the landowners, basically. And then, late in 1752, on the 2nd of September, McCarthy wrote to the governor down in New Orleans. Now, the next slide. A loose translation, I thought you'd enjoy this French. Complete absence of punctuation. Roughly, the fields on this side are worn out. Most of the inhabitants are taking up lands on the side of Saint Genevieve. Saint Genevieve will become more considerable than this place. McCarthy was writing from Kaskaskia. There are at present 27 inhabitants who have lands, and whose lands include 413 arpents frontage. Counts and scores. So all of a sudden we've got 93 arpents frontage. This place reports of his lands that they are more extensive, more fertile, and better. McCarthy's letter demonstrates a strong belief in the agricultural potential of the village and the remarkable growth of the village in less than a year. 7 inhabitants to 27, 34 to 93 frontage, 797. If these 93 are as deep as those original 34, there were 2,180 square arpents for cultivation. Now, even discounting that theoretical number, the growth's impressive. It triples in 7 months. And what accounts for this remarkable growth? In short, demand. Demand for what Saint Genevieve and the other French villages could produce. Demand spurred on by the planned construction of the French forts in western Pennsylvania, construction that would begin in the spring of 1753. The construction of the 4 forts would take 2 years to complete, but the garrisons could be counted on to continue to consume everything that Illinois country could produce into the indefinite future. Perhaps, or so it might have seemed in 1752, forever. A breeding market for Illinois agricultural production. And McCarthy and Saucier decided to build the new stone Fort Richard right in the midst of Illinois' most productive agricultural area. In the immediate vicinity of the villages of Chartres and Prairie-du-Rocher, near St. Philippe, just upstream from Saint Genevieve, the little village which McCarthy predicted so much for. It might be observed that Fort Richard was also approximately midway between Cahokia and Kaskaskia, not in terms of road miles, but in terms of river communication. It was faster to move downstream from Cahokia to the fort and upstream from Kaskaskia. From 1753 through 1759, flour and salted meat was gathered from the French villages, including Saint Genevieve, and convoy after convoy made the long haul to western Pennsylvania, although there never seemed to be enough to satisfy demand fully. There were poor crops everywhere again in 1756 and 57. Canada suffered such a severe shortage that there was actual famine in 1757 and 1758 during the winter. The posts on the Ohio Valley road faced shortages and garrisons had to be reduced in size. And throughout the war, there was certainly not enough to supply Illinois' traditional customers down the Mississippi. Food had to be imported from Saint Dominique, out in Haiti, for New Orleans, and the other settlements in southern Louisiana, and brought upriver as far as the Arkansas coast, all at tremendous expense. It's no wonder, though, with the market for Illinois flour and pork eager to buy every grain and oink, 1752 saw the beginning of extraordinary growth for Saint Genevieve. During the war, no shot was ever fired in anger at Fort Richard. But in addition to faithfully supplying the French posts by tremendous labor, the men from the garrison and from the settlements in Illinois, in all likelihood including men from Saint Genevieve, took part in combat against the English. 2 officers from Fort Richard, Charles Philippe Aubry and Francois Coulon de Villiers, the most prominent in this role, due to the practice of referring to officers in contemporary documents by their last name only. Francois Coulon de Villiers is often be confused with his brother Louis Coulon de Villiers, and even with McCarthy's second in command, Pierre-Joseph Néon de Villiers, was no relation at all. 1754, while England and France were still officially at peace, one of Francois' brothers, Joseph Coulon de Villiers de Jomonville, led a small French group to notify the British that they were trespassing on territory claimed by France. Young George Washington, commanding a detachment of Virginia militia, ambushed them and killed Jumonville and a number of others. This famous event played a major role in precipitating the French and Indian War. Louis Coulon de Villiers defeated Washington and forced his surrender at Fort Necessity the same year and captured Fort William Henry in 1757 before falling victim to smallpox. Francois Coulon de Villiers was a lieutenant in Illinois from 1746 to 54 when he was promoted to captain. In early 1756, he headed a convoy that brought supplies from Fort Richard to Fort Duquesne. Then he took a party of some 22 French, 32 Illinois, Shawnee, and Delaware and moved against Fort Granville, a substantial wooden fort with 4 bastions and 2 cannons in southern Pennsylvania. Villiers led an attack which continued all day, and during the night his forces managed to burn one of the bastions. The fort surrendered along with 30 soldiers, 3 women, and 7 children. Stories immediately spread in the French colonies that the prisoners had been massacred. In fact, one sergeant was tortured and killed by an Indian in a personal grudge for a vicious beating the sergeant had inflicted upon that Indian in the past. The other prisoners were divided between the French and the Indians according to custom, and Villiers led the entire group back to Fort Richard, where the French officers and civilians in the villages made a collection and ransomed the prisoners that had fallen to the Indians' lot. The entire group was then escorted to New Orleans, exchanged, sent to England, and by the time the information reached the colonies, the capture of Fort Granville was old news, and no one was much interested in the truth. The legend was reestablished of the massacre, and you can still find it online, despite the fact that it had been proved to be a complete falsehood within a year of the event. There were a number of other engagements involving men from the Illinois country. Most notably in 1758, Captain Aubry led troops and militia from the Illinois country to reinforce Fort Duquesne. When the English sent a column of 800 men under Major James Grant to seize Fort Duquesne by surprise ambush, Aubry and the men from Illinois were part of the force that fell upon him, utterly routed him. The English suffered over 200 casualties, killed or captured, including Grant himself. When the British finally marshaled overwhelming forces against Fort Duquesne, the commandant loaded the cannons, the munitions, and the prisoners on the bateaus and sent them downriver to Fort Richard. Some of those cannons then went to Fort Massiac, and those were moved eventually to Saint Genevieve, which is another story that I'll probably tell you maybe another day. They have an interesting history that goes up until 1806. 1759, Aubry and Villiers again moved with some 300 Marines and militia from the Illinois area up the Wabash Route. Transporting over 200,000 pounds of flour. With the British besieging Fort Niagara, the Marines and militia joined with other French forces and rushed to relieve the fort. Near La Belle Famille, a site about a mile south of the fort, they met the British and their Indian allies in prepared positions. The French made a brave but futile frontal attack, attempting to break through. Over half were killed or captured, and almost all of the common soldiers captured were slaughtered by the Indians. The British officers, perhaps in a show of class solidarity, saved a number of the French officers. Here's a painting, General Johnson saving a wounded French officer from the tomahawk of the North American Indian. Further, a feet-looking little tomahawk. Benjamin West. This was completed between 1764 and 1768. The painting may have been initially inspired by an incident at Lake George in 1755, but the architecture visible in the background and the uniforms of the men indicate that West had adapted the scene to the aftermath of La Belle Famille by Fort Niagara in 1759. Aubry and Villiers were both seriously wounded and captured, but they survived. The losses to the Illinois forces were horrendous. 6 officers, 2 cadets, 2 sergeants, 2 corporals, 30 Marines, and 54 of the area militia. With the defeat of the relief force and the walls breached by English artillery, Fort Niagara surrendered. No less than the capture of Quebec, the fall of Fort Niagara, doomed French Canada, and ultimately all of the French holdings in North America. And consider for a moment the tiny French population in the Illinois country in the 1750s. 54 militia dead. There must have been hardly a family affected. Add that to all the other reasons the French had to resent and fear the British occupation, and there's more than enough adequate basis to understand that widespread dispersion of the French community at the end of the war. Rather than live under the British, some went to France, but so many others moved to the western Spanish side of the river. We went to Saint Genevieve, and the memory of that great influx has perhaps obscured the earlier rapid growth of Saint Genevieve in the 1750s as the farmers of the French villages sought to maximize agricultural production to serve the war market. And that, I think, is how Saint Genevieve and Fort Deschartres and Fort Duquesne were linked together beginning in the year 1752.
Channel 7 and 98 TV and web broadcasting are made possible through contributions and donations from viewers like you. Thank you for your support.